Snow screamed to the pines of Ironback Ridge, a white fury swallowing the world. For 30 winters, Silas Morrow had been the only heartbeat in this frozen kingdom, a man carved from silence and stone, haunted by the ghosts in the canyon wind. His cabin light was a lonely ember in the vast, howling dark. Then shapes emerged from the blizzard's teeth. 10 figures, huddled and desperate against the killing cold. Women, Apache, exiles. What could drive 10 souls to the forgotten door through hell's own storm? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches your heart, make sure you're subscribed. Because tomorrow, I've got something extra special saved just for you. The cold wasn't just air, it was a living thing. It gnawed at the world's bones, settling deep into the crevices of the ancient mountains known as Ironback Ridge. It seeped through the thick adobe walls and mesquite log beams of Silas Morrow's solitary cabin, a stubborn defiance against the white oblivion outside. Inside, the air hung thick with the smells of wood smoke, cured mule deer hide, and the lingering tang of loneliness. A single kerosene lamp cast long, dancing shadows on walls lined with tools. A worn adze, a bucksaw missing a tooth, a coil of braided rawhide. Near the stone hearth, where pinyon logs crackled with a dry, desperate heat, Silas sat. He wasn't carving, not tonight. He was simply enduring. His hands, gnarled and scarred like old roots, rested on his knees, the lamplight catching the silver flecks in his thick, gray beard and the deep crevices around eyes the color of flint. 60 winters etched onto his face, 30 of them spent utterly alone in this high, unforgiving place. He stared into the flames, not seeing the fire, but the absence within it. The absence of laughter, of warmth that wasn't just physical. A small, crudely carved wooden horse, smoothed by decades of handling, sat on the rough-hewn mantelpiece. He didn't need to touch it. Its weight was a constant ache in his chest. Martha, little Ben, taken by the coughing sickness the first brutal winter, after they dared to dream of a life up here, away from the chaos below. The dream had turned to ash, and Silas had stayed, a monument to his own failure, speaking only to the wind and the wary mule deer. Solitude wasn't just his state. It was his armor, his penance. The relentless wind outside was his only conversation partner, a mournful dirge that matched the one in his soul. A sound, sharp and alien, cut through the wind's monotonous howl. Not an animal, not the groan of overburdened timber. A thump against his door. Solid, human. Silas froze. Every muscle, long accustomed to the slow rhythms of isolation, coiled tight. His hand, moving with a speed belying his years, closed around the worn walnut stock of the Sharp's rifle leaning against the hearthstones. He didn't raise it, not yet. He held his breath, listening past the shriek of the storm. Another thump, fainter this time, then a low, guttural moan, swallowed almost instantly by the blizzard's fury. Wariness warred with a colder instinct, the knowledge of what exposure could do. 30 years of turning inward hadn't entirely extinguished the spark of humanity, though it flickered dimly. He moved silently, boots scuffing the packed earth floor. He lifted the heavy wooden bar, the iron latch cold even through his calluses. Taking a deep breath, bracing himself against the anticipated blast of cold, he pulled the door open just enough to peer out. The sight stole his breath more effectively than the icy air. Figures, huddled together in the lee of the cabin wall, barely visible through the swirling white chaos. Not men, women, draped in tattered blankets and hides crusted with ice, their faces gaunt shadows beneath snow-laden shawls. 10 of them, their eyes wide and dark and desperate, met us through the narrow gap, not pleading, not yet, just existing on the razor's edge between survival and surrender. The wind snatched at their coverings, revealing glimpses of frost-whitened skin, cracked lips, exhaustion so profound it seemed a physical weight. One, taller than the others, stood slightly in front, her posture rigid despite the trembling Silas could see running through her frame. An elder woman beside her leaned heavily on a younger girl, her breath coming in ragged, Shallow gasps that fogged the air. Another clutched her side, face contorted not just from cold, but from a hidden pain. They were Apaches. Exiles? Refugees? The why didn't matter in that frozen instant. The sheer, desperate fact of them did. Silas's grip tightened on the sharps. Strangers. Women. Apache. Trouble, whispered the wary hermit within him. But the sight of the elder woman's blue-tinged lips, the raw, frostbitten cheek of the girl, the utter exhaustion in their frozen postures that struck a chord deeper than suspicion. It echoed the helplessness he'd known, the cold finality he'd witnessed. His jaw clenched. The door creaked wider on protesting hinges. He didn't speak, just stepped back, holding the door open against the wind's push, creating a narrow passage from the white hell into the dim, smoky warmth. His gesture was clear, though his eyes remained guarded, scanning the group, the swirling snow beyond them for any sign of threat accompanying their desperation. They moved slowly, stiffly, like figures carved from ice beginning to thaw. The leader entered first, her dark eyes sweeping the single room, the hearth, the rifle still held loosely at Silas's side, the shadows in the corners, with a swift, assessing intelligence. The others followed, a silent procession of suffering. They brought the storm's cold with them, a palpable wave that made the fire sputter. They didn't rush toward the heat. They huddled together near the door, dripping snow onto the floor, their collective shivering the only sound beyond the crackling fire and the wind's lament. They avoided looking directly at him, their gazes fixed on the floor or darting nervously around the unfamiliar space. Their silence was thick, heavy with unspoken trauma. What horrors had driven him out into a killing blizzard? Silas lowered the rifle, leaning it carefully back against the hearth. The immediate threat, if it existed, seemed absent. The threat of their freezing to death on his threshold, however, was undeniable. He moved past them, the scent of wet wool and unwashed exhaustion strong in the enclosed space. He went to a heavy oak chest against the far wall, lifting the lid to reveal folded wool blankets, thick and gray, smelling faintly of lanolin and cedar. He pulled out a stack, his movements economical, devoid of unnecessary grace. He placed the pile on the rough-hewn table near the women. "Blankets," he said, his voice a dry rasp, and used a human speech. It sounded foreign even to his own ears. They stared at the blankets, then at him, uncertainty warring with a dazed need. The leader was the first to move. She reached out, her hand trembling visibly now, and took the top blanket. It was a simple gesture, but it broke the stasis. She didn't wrap it around herself. Instead, she turned and draped it carefully over the shoulders of the shivering elder beside her, tucking it close with a tenderness that belied her own exhaustion. Only then did she take another for herself. Silas watched this small exchange. A flicker of something, recognition, respect, stirred in his chest, cold and long dormant. He turned to the hearth. Hanging from an iron hook was a blackened kettle, half full of water kept warm by the fire's edge. Nearby sat a sack of coarse cornmeal, a clay jar holding precious salt, and a burlap sack containing strips of jerked venison. He didn't ask if they were hungry. Their hollowed cheeks spoke volumes. He scooped cornmeal into the kettle, added water from a clay jug, a pinch of salt, and a generous handful of the tough, dark meat. He stirred it with a long-handled wooden spoon, the rhythmic scrape against the pot, the only sound besides the fire and the wind. The smell of the warming broth, simple as it was, began to permeate the cabin. It was a primal scent, cutting through the cold and fear. Silas felt, rather than saw, the subtle shift in the huddled group. The rigid tension eased infinitesimally. Shoulders slumped a fraction lower, not in defeat, but in the first tentative release of survival's unbearable strain. Eyes, previously fixed on the floor or darting nervously, began to flicker towards a pot, drawn by the promise of warmth from within. He worked silently, pouring the thin stew into chipped earthenware bowls he hadn't used in years. He placed the bowls on the table, a short distance from the blankets. He stepped back, leaning against the heavy timber frame of the door to the small lean-to where he stored firewood and tools, giving them space. His presence was still a looming uncertainty in the room. The women exchanged glances, a silent communication passing between them. The leader stepped forward again. She picked up a bowl, her movements deliberate. She didn't drink immediately. Instead, she held Silas's gaze across the dim, smoky room. Her eyes, deep pools of dark resilience in a face etched with hardship, held his without flinching. "A pony," she said, her voice low and gravelly, strained by cold and disuse, yet clear. Just the one word. A name, an offering, a fragile bridge cast across the chasm of fear and solitude. Silas met her gaze. The flint in his eyes didn't soften, but a fraction of the wariness retreated, replaced by a weary acknowledgement. He gave a single, slow nod. No name offered in return. Not yet. The weight of 30 winters of silence was heavy, but the offering hung in the air, warmer than the steam rising from the bowls. A pony turned, handing the first bowl to the elder. Slowly, cautiously, the others began to take their portions. The quiet slurps and sighs a new counterpoint to the fire's crackle and the relentless storm outside. Silas watched them, these 10 ghosts who had materialized from the blizzard. Their presence filled the small cabin, a disorienting shift after decades of emptiness. He saw the way one young woman winced as she moved, favoring her left leg beneath her sodden skirts. He noticed another, perhaps no more than 15, clutch something small and hard beneath her shawl, her knuckles white. The elder's hands, gripping the warm bowl, were swollen and red, the joints distorted. They were broken, yes, but not defeated. A spark, faint but undeniable, burned in their collective gaze now that the immediate edge of death had receded. He turned to look out the small, thick glass window beside the door. The blizzard still raged, a solid wall of white pressing against the pane, obscuring the world beyond a few feet. It was a prison of ice, isolating them all. He was about to turn back when a sound, distinct and chilling, cut through the lower register of the wind's howl. Not the groan of timber, not the snap of a frozen branch. It was sharper, higher, like the distant, metallic clink of a bridle bit or the frozen snap of a wet rain. It came from the direction of the old trail leading up the ridge. It was there, then gone, swallowed instantly by the storm's vast indifference. It could have been nothing. Ice cracking off a rock ledge. A trick of the wind, whistling through a crevice. Silas stared into blinding white, his body rigid, the momentary easing of tension replaced by a cold prickle that had nothing to do with the weather. His hand instinctively drifted towards the stock of the sharps leaning against the hearthstones, his knuckles whitening. The women, sensing the shift in him, froze mid-movement, bowls halfway to lips, their eyes widening once more, locking onto him with renewed fear. The fragile warmth of the shared meal vanished, replaced by the suffocating silence of anticipation. The storm screamed on, indifferent, but a new, more dangerous silence had fallen inside the cabin. Someone or something was out there in the white fury, and Silas Morrow knew, deep in his bones, that the storm hadn't just brought 10 desperate women to his door. It had brought their shadows, too. The silence inside the cabin was absolute, a hell breath thick with terror. The metallic clink, sharp, intrusive, utterly out of place in the storm's organic roar, had vanished, leaving only the wind's howl and the frantic drumming of 10 frightened hearts. Silas Morrow stood frozen at the window, knuckles white where they gripped the sharp's rifle stock, his gaze piercing the swirling white chaos beyond the thick glass. He saw nothing but the blizzard's furious dance, nothing but snow and shadow. The women were statues, bowls forgotten, steam curling uselessly into frigid air. Their eyes, wide and dark, were locked on Silas, reading the rigid line of his back, the tension coiled in his shoulders. A pony slowly lowered her own bowl, her movements deliberate, her face a mask of controlled fear. The elder woman, Chitsa, Silas had heard one of them whisper the name earlier in a moment of distress, clutched her blanket tighter, her breath shallow and whistling. The young one who had been clutching something beneath her shawl, Elan, a pony had named her quietly while tending to her earlier, pressed closer to another woman, her small hand disappearing back into the folds of her garment. Nothing could be nothing. The thought was a flimsy raft in the sea of Silas's suspicion. 30 winters alone taught a man the language of his mountain. The groan of ice-laden pines, the shriek of wind through rock fissures, the hollow boom of snow sliding off a roof. These were familiar. That sound? Sharp, deliberate, like iron on iron. Bridle bit, spur trap chain snap taut. It spoke of presence, of something that didn't belong to the indifferent fury of Ironback Ridge. He held his position for a long minute, the cold radiating off the glass panes seeping into his bones. Finally, he turned the movement stiff. He didn't holster the sharps. He kept it loosely cradled in the crook of his arm, a silent declaration. His eyes swept over the huddled group, lingering for a fraction on a pony. He gave a single, curt jerk of his head toward the fire, an unspoken command. Eat! Stay warm. Stay quiet. The tension didn't dissipate, but the women slowly resumed their cautious movements. The scraping of spoons against earthenware was hesitant, the slurping sounds muted. The warmth of the stew seemed a small, fragile thing against the vast, listening cold outside. Silas moved away from the window, his boots heavy on the packed earth floor. He checked the heavy wooden bar across the door. Solid. He peered to the narrow gaps between the thick adobe wall and the rough-hewn door frame, seeing only a shifting curtain of white. He banked the fire, adding 2 thick chunks of pinyon. The flames leapt, casting longer, more restless shadows. The cabin felt smaller than ever, the air thick with unspoken fear, and the smell of wet wool, stew, and wood smoke. The storm raged for another day and night, a relentless siege. The world beyond the cabin walls ceased to exist, reduced to a howling, white void. Confinement bred a strange, tense intimacy. The women, driven by ingrained resilience and the immediate need for survival, began to organize. Without being asked, they took turns tending the fire, ensuring the precious heat never waned. They found rags, began mopping the melted snow tracked in, keeping the packed earth floor as dry as possible. One woman, Sikiai, whose hands were less swollen than Chitsa's, carefully inspected the meager food stores, counting strips of jerk venison, measuring cornmeal with quiet efficiency. Silas watched, a silent sentinel. He saw a pony gently unwrap the soaked, frozen bindings from Chitsa's feet. The elder's toes were waxy white, the skin tight and blistered. A pony murmured something low and soothing in her own tongue, her fingers surprisingly deft as she rubbed a pungent salve Silas had offered, bear grease infused with dried yarrow, onto the damaged skin, then wrapped them carefully in dry strips of clean linen he'd pulled from his chest. The care, the quiet strength in the pony's movements, resonated with something ancient and buried deep within Silas. He remembered Martha, hunched over their sunben's cradle during a lesser storm, humming a lullaby, her face etched with worry and fierce love. The memory was a physical blow, a cold ache sharper than the wind. His hand drifted to the small wooden horse on the mantel, his thumb tracing the smooth curve of its back, worn down by 3 decades of solitary grief. He turned away abruptly, the gesture unnoticed by the women absorbed in their tasks. On the second morning, as the storm's fury finally began to abate, revealing a world transformed under a heavy, pristine blanket of snow, Silas knew he had to venture out. The water barrel in the lean-to was low. The traps needed checking, not for food. The women had consumed precious reserves, but to see if they'd yielded anything and to ensure they weren't damaged. Mostly, he needed to see, to know. He pulled on his heavy buffalo coat, wrapped a thick wool scarf around his neck and lower face, and checked the load in his sharps. He felt the weight of their eyes as he prepared. A pony stepped forward, holding out a pair of rawhide snowshoes she'd found leaning against the woodpile. Her dark eyes met his, unreadable but intense. "Wind! Cuts deep," she said, her voice rough but clear. It was the first unsolicited thing she'd said to him. An observation, a warning, perhaps, faintly, a threat of concern. Silas grunted, a sound that could have meant anything. He took the snowshoes. "Bar the door behind me," he instructed, his voice muffled by the scarf. "Don't open it for anyone but me." He didn't wait for acknowledgement. He lifted the heavy bar, shouldered the door open against the drift piled against it, and stepped out into the blinding, silent world. The cold hit him like a physical wall. Stealing his breath, the world was reduced to stark contrasts. The blinding white of the snow under a pale, cloud-filtered sun, the deep, sharp blue of the sky with the clouds parted over distant peaks, the inky black shadows cast by the towering pines. The air was crystalline, brittle, scouring. He strapped on the snowshoes and moved away from the cabin, the rhythmic crunch squeak of his steps unnaturally loud in the muffled stillness. He checked the nearest trap line first, a series of deadfalls and snares along a frozen creek bed. Empty, disturbed only by the heavy snowfall. He refilled the water barrel from a hole chopped in the creek ice, the water so cold it burned his hands even through thick mittens. His eyes scanned constantly, not just for game signs, but for anything else, anything human. He found it near the edge of the clearing, about 50 yards south of the cabin, partially sheltered by a gnarled juniper. Not a hoof print. The snow was too deep, too fresh. It was a broken branch, a low-hanging limb of a ponderosa pine, snapped cleanly, about shoulder height. The break was sharp, the wood pale and raw against the dark bark. Snow hadn't yet covered the exposed splinters. Recent, too high for a deer or elk, the kind of branch a man on horseback might brush against, or snap deliberately to mark a trail obscured by snow. Silas crouched, examining the ground beneath the branch. The snow was churned, difficult to read, but amidst the loose powder, pressed deep into the frozen earth beneath, was a faint, unmistakable crescent impression of a shod horse's hoof. One clear print. Deliberate? Accidental? He couldn't tell, but it was confirmation. The clink hadn't been the wind. Someone had been here, watching, waiting out the storm. Perhaps a cold fury, colder than the mountain air, began to simmer beneath Silas's ribs. This was his solitude, his penance, his frozen kingdom. And now it was invaded, not just by 10 desperate souls seeking refuge, but by the shadows that pursued them, threatening to shatter the fragile sanctuary he'd offered. He scanned the tree line, the ridge above, every shadow suddenly pregnant with menace. He saw nothing. The silence pressed in, more oppressive than the storm's roar had been. He worked quickly then, checking the remaining traps. One held a scrawny, frozen jackrabbit, meager but welcome, his movements sharp with renewed vigilance. As he turned back toward the cabin, his eyes caught something else. Near the base of the massive ponderosa that marked the start of the old trail down the ridge, the trail the women must have come up, carved crudely into the thick bark, about eye level, was a mark. Fresh sap oozed from the deep gouges. It wasn't a word. It was a symbol. 2 intersecting lines, like a crude cross, but with a shorter, diagonal line slashed through the bottom quadrant. It meant nothing to Silas, but its intent was chillingly clear. A marker, a sign left for others, or a warning. We know where they are. He approached the cabin, the rabbit hanging limp from his belt. He stomped the snow from his boots loudly, a deliberate signal. He heard the scrape of the bar being lifted inside before he even reached for the latch. A pony opened the door just enough for him to enter, her eyes immediately scanning the tree line behind him before she closed and barred it swiftly. The women were gathered near the fire, their faces taut with anxiety. They saw the rabbit, a flicker of relief, but their eyes quickly returned to Silas's face, searching for news. He shrugged off his coat, the cold air clinging to him. He didn't speak immediately. He walked to the table, pulled his skinning knife from its sheath, and began the grim task of preparing the meager catch. The rhythmic scrape of the blade against fur and flesh filled the tense silence. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and gravelly, not looking up from his work. "Found a branch broke. Fresh. He paused, the knife stilling for a heartbeat. Horse print. Shod. Another pause, longer this time. He could feel their collective breath held. And a mark on the big pine by the trail, carved. He didn't describe the symbol. He didn't need to. The sharp intake of breath from several women. The way a pony's hand flew to the small beaded pouch hidden beneath her tunic. A gesture of instinctive dread told him everything. The color drained from Elon's face. Chitsa closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent invocation. The fragile warmth they'd begun to build, the tentative acts of cooperation, shriveled in the face of this tangible evidence. Their past wasn't just behind them. It had found their footprints in the snow. Silas finished skinning the rabbit, the small carcass pitifully bare on the worn wood. He dropped the fur into a bucket for later tanning. He wiped his knife clean, the blade gleaming dully in the firelight. He looked at a pony, her face now a stoic mask, but her eyes held a storm of their own. Fear, yes, but also a fierce, defiant resolve. "What mark?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, yet cutting through the stillness. Silas met her gaze. 2 lines crossed. Another cut through the bottom. He sketched it roughly in the air with a callous finger. A pony didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened. She exchanged a long, silent look with Sikiai and Chitsa, a look heavy with shared understanding, with grim recognition. She turned back to Silas, her dark eyes holding his. "Nanton's mark," she said, the name dropping into the silence like a stone into a frozen pond. "He does not forget. He does not forgive." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. The name, uttered with such finality, hung in the air, colder than a mountain night creeping back over Ironback Ridge. The sanctuary of the cabin walls suddenly felt perilously thin. Nantan was coming. The name Nantan hung in the cabin air like gun smoke after a shot. Acrid, dangerous, impossible to ignore. It extinguished the fragile warmth that had begun to seep into the corners of Silas Morrow's solitary world. The women drew tighter together, a silent, shivering constellation of fear. A pony's hand remained clenched over the small beaded pouch beneath her tunic, her knuckles white. Chitsa's silent prayers became audible murmurs, low and desperate. Elon, the young one, pressed her face against Sikiai's shoulder, her small frame trembling visibly. Silas finished wiping his skinning knife, the action deliberate, a grounding ritual in the sudden storm of dread. He slid it back into its sheath at his belt, the soft snick loud in the stillness. He looked at a pony, her face a mask of stoic resolve now, though her eyes held the flinty edge of hunted prey. "Nantan," he repeated, the name unfamiliar, harsh on his tongue. "He wants you." A pony met his gaze, a flicker of something like shame, quickly masked by defiance, crossing her features. "He wants what we took." Her voice was low, gravelly. What was ours to take when they came? She didn't elaborate on they. The raid, the burning, the exile. The details were still shrouded in the blizzard of their past, but the shape was clear enough. Violence, lost flight, and now relentless pursuit. Silas grunted, a sound that could have meant understanding or merely acknowledgement. The why mattered less than the what now. His mountain, his frozen sanctuary, was now a battleground he hadn't chosen. He scanned the cabin, the thick adobe walls, the heavy timbered door, the small, high windows shuttered against the cold, sturdy against the elements, but against determined men, a different reckoning. His gaze fell on the small wooden horse on the mantel, a relic of a life shattered by a different kind of storm. Protecting 10 women felt like an impossible echo of failing 2. Yet, the memory of Martha's fierce love, of Ben's trusting eyes, stirred something colder and harder than grief within him now, a stubborn refusal to let history repeat its cruelty on his watch. "Right," he rasped, pushing himself away from the table. The single word cut through the fear. Doors solid, shutters need bracing, windows too low. He moved towards a woodpile stacked neatly against the far wall, selecting thick, seasoned lengths of juniper. Need crossbars. Inside, for the shutters. He didn't ask for help. He simply started working, dragging a heavy workbench into the center of the room, near the largest window, the one facing the old trail. He found his adze and a draw knife, the rasp of metal on with a new, purposeful counterpoint to the wind still whining outside. The women watched him, the shift from paralyzing fear to tangible action breaking their stasis. Apache was the first to move. Without a word, she picked up a smaller length of what Silas had discarded, examining it. She gestured to Sikiai, who found a worn whetstone and began sharpening a small skinning knife of her own, likely salvaged during their flight. Silas worked on the main crossbar, shaping it to fit snugly into iron brackets he'd forged years ago but never needed. He felt eyes on him. Elon had crept closer, her fear momentarily overridden by a child's curiosity about the tools and the shavings curling onto the packed earth floor. She watched his hands, the way the adze bit into the wood, the rhythmic scrape of the draw knife smoothing the grain. Her gaze was intense, absorbing. Silas paused, holding the draw knife. He remembered Ben, maybe a year or two younger than Elon, watching him repair a harness with that same wide-eyed fascination. The memory was a physical pang, sharp and sudden. He looked at Elon, really looked at her. The smudges of dirt couldn't hide the sharp intelligence in her dark eyes, nor the deep shadows of exhaustion and terror beneath them. Her small hand unconsciously touched the hidden lump beneath her shawl, the object she guarded so fiercely. He held out the draw knife, handle first. It was a simple tool, but in his world, it was an extension of self-reliance. "Hold it firm," he instructed, his voice gruff but lacking its usual edge. "Pull towards you. Smooth, like this." He demonstrated slowly on a scrap piece, the blade gliding, peeling off a thin, even curl. Elon hesitated, glancing back at Apache. Apache gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Elon reached out, her small hand wrapping around the worn wooden handle. It was too big for her, but she gripped it tightly, mimicking Silas's motion on the scrap wood. The first pull was hesitant, the blade skipping. Silas didn't correct her. He just watched. Her second pull was smoother, the curl thinner. A tiny, fierce concentration settled on her face, momentarily pushing back the fear. Silas felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. Not just memory, but a fragile thread of connection, spun from shared purpose and the quiet passing of knowledge. The work continued. Apache and Sikiai, using Sikiai's sharpened knife, began cutting rawhide strips into length for lashings. Others took turns at the fire, ensuring it burned hot and bright. Chitsa, despite her painful feet, began inspecting the women's meager clothing, her skilled fingers finding weak seams and tears, silently planning repairs with threads salvaged from a frayed blanket edge. The cabin filled not with chatter, but with the sounds of survival. The rasp of tools, the crackle of flames, the soft tear of rawhide, the rhythmic scrape of Elon carefully smoothing wood under Silas's watchful eye. It was a fragile piece, woven under the shadow of Nantan, but it was tangible. They were fortifying not just the cabin, but themselves. Later, as dusk began to paint the snow outside in shades of violet and deep blue, Silas knew he had to check the perimeter again. The rabbit was stewing in the pot with the last of the cornmeal, a thin, precious gruel. He strapped on his snowshoes, the sharps of familiar, cold weight in his hands. Apache watched him from the doorway, her expression unreadable. "Be swift," she said softly. It wasn't a request. It was a shared understanding of the danger stalking the white silence. Silas moved with the silent caution of a hunting wolf. The snow was crusted now, crunching softly under his snowshoes. He scanned the tree line, the drifts, the ridge above, every shadow a potential threat. He checked the snares first. Empty. Then he circled wide, approaching the frozen creek where he'd refilled a water barrel. He saw it before he reached the hole in the ice. The barrel lay on its side, not tipped over by wind or animal. Kicked, deliberately, the precious water, painstakingly hauled and melted, had soaked into the snow, leaving a dark, frozen stain. Nearby, the thick rawhide strap he'd used to lower the bucket into the hole had been severed, not worn through, cut cleanly with a sharp blade. A cold fury, colder than the ice beneath his feet, surged through Silas. This wasn't just observation. This was sabotage. A message. We can take what you need. We can make you suffer. He crouched, examining the tracks around the barrel. Boot prints, large, overlapping in the churned snow. At least 2 men. They hadn't bothered to hide their presence this time. They'd wanted him to find this. He followed the tracks for a few yards. They led back toward the tree line, towards the old trail. And there, carved into the ice-sheathed trunk of an aspen sapling at the very edge of the clearing, was the mark again. The cross lines, the diagonal slash. Fresh, deeper than the last. Nantan, tightening the noose. Silas scanned the darkening woods, the sharps coming up instinctively to his shoulder. He saw nothing but the skeletal trees and deepening shadows. But he felt it. Eyes. Watching. The silence pressed in, heavy and malevolent. They were close. Bolder. Testing his defenses. Sapping his resources. The water was a critical blow. Melting enough snow for 10 people took time and precious fuel. He turned back toward the cabin. Moving faster now. Urgency worn with caution. He needed to get back. He needed to warn them. As he approached the cabin clearing, the last light of dusk catching the snow in a cold, blue gleam, he saw something else. Propped against the base of the massive ponderosa pine, the one where the first mark had been carved, was a new object. It was a crude doll, made of twisted grass and bound with a thin strip of dyed red cloth, the kind sometimes used to tie back hair. Apache work. But not made with care, made with malice. One of its grass-stuffed arms had been torn off. A tiny shard of obsidian, sharp and black, had been jammed where its heart would be. Silas stopped dead. The breath froze in his lungs. It wasn't just a threat. It was a promise of violence aimed not just at the women, but at their spirit, at their future, at Elon, who clutched her hidden treasure. He looked up at the cabin. Its single window glowing faintly with firelight, a fragile beacon in the gathering dark. Inside were 10 lives, huddled around that fire, mending clothes, smoothing wood, trying to hold on to hope. And out here in the cruel, beautiful wilderness he'd called his own for 30 winters, something dark and vengeful was circling, leaving its terrible tokens in the snow. He scooped up the mutilated doll, the rough grass cold and brittle in his hand, the obsidian shard glinting like a malevolent eye. The walk back to the cabin door felt endless. He stomped the snow from his boots, the sound unnaturally loud. He didn't wait for Bar to lift. He knocked, a specific, heavy rhythm they'd agreed upon. A pony opened the door, her eyes instantly searching his face, then dropping to the object in his hand. He stepped inside, the warmth a stark contrast to the icy dread he carried. He closed the door, barred it solidly. Then he held out the grass doll. He didn't need to speak. The gasp from the women, the way Elon's hand flew to her own hidden object beneath her shawl, the strangled cry that escaped Chitz's lips. It told a story louder than any words. The color drained from a pony's face, replaced by a cold, terrifying fury. "Where?" she breathed, her voice a blade of ice. "By the big pine," Silas said, his own voice rough. Water barrels kicked over. Strap cut. He placed the doll on the table, the obsidian shard catching the firelight. He's not just watching. He's here, and he's playing cruel. The fire crackled, the only sound in the cabin suddenly filled with the silent, suffocating weight of a predator's taunt. The fortifications they built felt laughably inadequate against malice that left mutilated dolls in the snow. Nantan wasn't just coming. He was already whispering his threats in the frozen dark, tightening his grip on Ironback Ridge. The storm outside had passed, but a far more dangerous one, born of human cruelty, was gathering just beyond the thin adobe walls. The mutilated grass doll lay on the rough-hewn table like an obscenity, the obsidian shard glinting malevolently in the firelight. The fragile industry that filled the cabin, the rasp of tools, the tear of rawhide, died instantly, choked by a silence thicker and colder than the snowdrifts outside. Chitsa's whispered prayers ceased, her breath catching in a ragged sob. Elon whimpered, her small hand clutching desperately at the hidden shape beneath her shawl, her eyes wide with a terror that mirrored the violation of the crude effigy. Sikiai turned away, her shoulders hunched as if struck. Aponi, however, didn't flinch. Her face hardened into a mask of cold fury, her dark eyes fixed on the doll, then lifting to meet Silas's gaze. The fear was still there deep down, but was submerged beneath a rising tide of defiance. "He mocks the breath in our bodies," Aponi stated, her voice low and grating, like stone on stone. "He seeks to break us before he breaks the door." She picked up the doll, her fingers tightening around the rough grass body, ignoring the sharp obsidian. This is Nantan. His cruelty is his strength, and his weakness. She didn't elaborate, but the set of her jaw spoke volumes. This was personal, deeply personal. Silas watched her, the cold fury in his own chest finding an echo in her rigid posture. He remembered Martha facing down a pack of snarling coyotes that had cornered their milk cow, pitchfork in hand, her small frame radiating a terrifying, protective ferocity. Aponi held that same fire now, not for a cow, but for the lives huddled in this fragile shelter. The memory of Martha's courage, usually a source of aching loss, now ignited a different spark, a grim determination to stand his ground. He wants water? Air? He can choke on mountain snow, Silas rasped, turning away from the table. The doll was a weapon of fear. Action was the only antidote. Bar stays down. Fire stays high. We watch. He moved towards a woodpile again, not for fortifications this time, but for smaller, deadlier purposes. He selected stout branches of seasoned juniper, thick as his wrist, and began shaping them with his adze, not smoothing, but creating brutal, jagged points. The women understood. The shared dread coalesced into a shared resolve. Sikiai retrieved her sharpened knife and began meticulously honing the points Silas roughed out, her movements precise, her expression grimly focused. Others, guided by Aponi's curt instructions in Apache, began bundling dried grasses and pine needles into tight, prickly balls. Chitsa, despite her pain, directed younger women to fill every available container, pots, bowls, a hollow gourd, with packed snow near the hearth, ready to melt for essential water, conserving fuel. The cabin transformed from a shelter under siege into a hive preparing for war, a quiet, desperate industry, replacing the stunned silence. Elon hovered near Silas, watching him lash the sharpened stakes together into crude, deadly caltrops. Spiked traps meant for booted feet. Her earlier fascination was gone, replaced by a solemn intensity. She reached into the folds of her shawl and carefully withdrew the object she guarded so fiercely. It wasn't food or a weapon. It was a small carving, a bear no larger than Silas's thumb, meticulously shaped from a piece of dark, polished wood, perhaps oak root. The detail was astonishing for its size. The curve of the powerful shoulders, the suggestion of a snout, the tiny, fierce eyes. It was warm from her touch. She held out towards Silas, not offering it, but showing it. Her voice was a thin whisper. "Hoon," she said, the Apache word unfamiliar to Silas, but imbued with reverence. From before, grandfather made. Her eyes darted towards a mutilated doll on the table, then back to the bear. "Strength," she added, the English word tentative but clear. It was a fragment of her world, a talisman of the life ripped away, carried through snow and terror. Showing it to Silas, the gruff outsider, was an act of profound, terrified trust. Silas looked from the delicate carving to the crude spikes in his hands. Both were instruments of survival, born from different worlds, different hands. He gave a slow nod, the tightness in his chest returning, not from grief this time, but from the weight of the small, fierce trust placed in him. Strong, he agreed gruffly, his gaze meeting hers for a moment. He saw not just fear, but the fierce spark that carved the bear, the spark Nanton sought to extinguish. He returned to his work, the stakes taking on a new significance. As darkness fully claimed the ridge, pressing against the shuttered windows, a pony approached Silas. She held the small beaded pouch she always touched in moments of dread. It was intricately woven with geometric patterns in deep red, black, and white beads, a tiny circle of turquoise sewn into its center. "This," she said, her voice low, "holds Earth from Argawa, our home place, before the fire, before Nantan and his wolves came in the night." She didn't describe the raid, the screams, the burning lodges, but the raw pain in her eyes painted a harrowing picture. They took much: gold dust from the creek, furs, women some. Her jaw tightened. "We took only what was ours, our lives, this earth, and..." Her gaze flickered towards Chitsa, who held a bundle close, her expression unreadable. "Something Nantan values more than gold, a thing of spirit. He hunts not just women, he hunts his own shame." She tied the pouch securely back inside her tunic. "The earth remembers. It gives strength." Silas absorbed this. Not just outlaws then, something deeper, more vicious. A theft that struck at Nanton's pride or power. The pouch, the hidden bundle Chitsa guarded. These were the sparks that ignited this deadly pursuit across the frozen wilderness. He didn't ask for details. The why was secondary to the imminent how of stopping it. Later, under a moon so bright it turned the snow into crushed diamonds and the pines into stark, inky sentinels, Silas slipped out. The cold was a physical blow, the silence absolute and watchful. He carried the caltrops and the prickly grass bundles. He moved like a ghost, placing the spike traps strategically in the deep drifts near the cabin's blind spots and along the most likely approaches from the tree line. The grass bundles, designed to explode into choking clouds of dust and needles if disturbed. He concealed near the door and the remaining water stores in the lean-to. He checked the perimeter, his sharps a cold comfort against the vast, listening dark. Nothing stirred but the occasional whisper of wind-sifted snow. He was near the sabotaged waterhole, scanning the ice-sheathed trees, when he heard it. Not the clink this time. A soft, rhythmic crunch. Too regular for an animal. Boots on crusted snow. Clothes. Silas melted into the deeper shadow of a boulder, heart hammering against his ribs. He eased the sharps forward, the long barrel resting on the cold stone. Peering around the edge, he saw him, a figure, bulky in furs, moving cautiously through the moon-drenched clearing, maybe 30 yards away. Not Nantan. This man was younger, leaner, scanning the ground, heading toward the area where Silas had placed the caltrops near the woodpile lean-to. A scout, testing the defenses, looking for weakness. Silas sighted down the barrel, the moon glinting coldly on the steel. He could end it. One shot, echoing in the silent night, and one threat would vanish. But it would alert every other soul on the mountain. It would scream their position, and it might bring Nanton's full fury crashing down immediately. He held his breath, finger resting beside the trigger. The scout took another step, then another, directly toward the concealed spikes. Crunch, a sharp, brittle sound, different from snow. A choked-off cry, more surprise than pain, split the night. The scout lurched, stumbling forward, clutching his leg. He'd stepped squarely on a caltrop. He cursed, a guttural, panic sound. Tried to pull his foot free. The jagged would bury deep in his boot sole. Silas didn't hesitate. He stepped out from behind the boulder. The sharps leveled. "Move an inch," he called, his voice cutting to the frozen air like a whip crack. "And the next sound you hear will be your lungs emptying that." The scout froze, hunched over his impaled foot, his face a pale mask of pain and shock in the moonlight. He stared at Silas, at the impossibly long rifle pointed unwaveringly at his chest. Fear warred with fury in his eyes. He was young. Silas saw, barely more than a boy, but his eyes held the hard glint of someone accustomed to violence. "You're a dead man, hermit," the scout spat, his voice trembling with pain and bravado. "Nanton's coming. He knows you're hiding his property. He knows you're weak. 10 women? You can't hold them. Can't hold this rock." He tried to straighten, wincing as the movement jarred his trapped foot. "He'll burn you out, or freeze you out. He don't care which. Just wants what's his and your scalp for the trouble." A vicious grin split his face. Saw the little one peek in earlier. Pretty thing. Nanton's got plans for the young ones. The words were like a physical blow. Silas's finger tightened on the trigger, the urge to silence his venom almost overwhelming. But killing him wouldn't stop Nanton. It would only hasten the attack. And the threat against Elon, against all of them, solidified his resolve into something colder than the surrounding ice. "Tell Nanton," Silas said, his voice dangerously low. "This mountain's held worse than him. Tell him Silas Morrow remembers how to bury trespassers." He gestured sharply with a rifle barrel. "Now crawl, back the way you came, and pray I don't change my mind for you reach the trees." The scout hesitated, hatred burning in his eyes, but the pain and the unwavering rifle muzzle decided him. With a groan, he wrenched his foot free, leaving the caltrip embedded in his boot, dark blood staining the pristine snow. He half-crawled, half-limped toward the tree line, leaving a ragged, crimson trail. Silas watched him vanish into blackness under the pines, the scout's labored breathing fading into the wind's sigh. He stood there long after the scout disappeared, the sharp still raised, the moon bathing the clearing in its cold, indifferent light. The scout's words echoed in his mind. "He's coming. Burn you out. Freeze you out. Plans for the young ones." The sabotage, the doll, the scout, they weren't just probes. They were the tightening coils of a noose. Nanton wasn't lurking anymore. He was preparing to strike. Silas turned back toward the cabin, a dark silhouette against the moonlit snow. He needed to warn them. They needed to be ready. As he approached the door, his boot crunched on something half buried in the snow near the threshold. Not a natural branch. He bent down, brushing away the powder. It was a knife. A skinning knife, its blade clean and sharp. Not his. Not one of the women's. The handle was wrapped in faded red cloth, identical to the strip used on the mutilated doll. Stuck onto the point of the blade with a dab of frozen pitch was a single, perfect white owl feather. The message was chillingly clear. Nanton's scout hadn't just come to probe. He'd come to deliver a final warning, and he'd left it right at their door. The time for traps and taunts was ending. The storm of violence was gathering on their very threshold. Silas picked up the knife, the cold steel biting into his bare hand, the owl feather trembling in the icy breeze. He looked up at the cabin, the single window glowing faintly, and knew the fragile sanctuary of Ironback Ridge was about to shatter. The knife lay cold and accusing in Silas's hand, the owl feather trembling like a captured ghost in the pre-dawn breeze. Its message was no longer a threat. It was a death knell. Nanton wasn't circling anymore. He was at the gate. The crimson-stained snow where the scout had limped away, the mutilated doll, the severed water strap. They were the final brushstrokes on a portrait of imminent violence. Silas shoved the knife into his belt, the feather brushing rough wool, and pushed into the cabin, slamming the heavy bar home with finality that echoed in the tense silence. The women were waiting, clustered near the fire, their faces pale but set. They'd seen the knife through the shutter crack. A pony stood tall, the beaded pouch clutched in one hand, her skinning knife in the other. Sikiai held a sharpened stake. Chitsa clutched her hidden bundle fiercely to her chest, and Elon pressed close to her, the little wooden bear gripped tightly in her small fist. The air crackled with desperate energy, the quiet hum of a bowstring drawn taut. He left his calling card, Silas rasped, holding up the knife briefly. Owl feather. Means he's done skulking. They'll come with the sun. He moved to the largest shuttered window, facing the clearing and the trail, carefully easing a viewing slot open an inch. The eastern sky was bleeding gray into black, outlining the skeletal pines against the snow like jagged teeth. A pony, the bundle. What is it he wants so bad? A pony's gaze flickered to Chitsa, the elder woman, her face etched with ancient sorrow, stepped forward. With trembling hands, she unwrapped the layers of worn deerskin, protecting her burden. Nestled within wasn't gold, nor jewels. It was a bundle of tightly bound eagle feathers, aged and powerful, surrounding a smooth river stone the color of dried blood. Carved into the stone surface was a complex spiral pattern, deep and ancient. But it was a central object that drew Silas's eye, a small, intricately carved wooden figure of a running horse, its lines fluid and strong, stained dark with time and smoke. It was clearly Apache work, but older, finer than anything Silas had seen, radiating a quiet, potent energy. "Tie," Chitsa whispered, her voice rough with reverence. "Spirit horse, heart of our band, taken generations ago from a place of power. We brought it home before the raid." She touched the stone gently. "Nantan, he is deemed no more. Not a holy man. He betrayed the ways. Used power for gold, for blood. He led the wolves who burned our Gawa." Her voice hardened. "He thought we took his gold, his stolen pelts. But this," she gestured to the bundle, "this power, this spirit, he craves it, to bend it, to make himself strong again after his shame. He hunts because without it, he is nothing, a ghost howling in the dark." Silas understood. It wasn't just vengeance. It was a hunger for power Nantan had squandered, a spiritual theft he couldn't abide. The spirit horse wasn't an object. It was the soul of what the women had fought to preserve. Protecting it meant protecting themselves, their past, their future. He looked from the sacred bundle to the small, worn wooden horse on his mantle. Ben's toy, a symbol of a different, shattered innocence. Both were talismans of loss and fears, enduring love. The parallel struck him with the force of a physical blow. He hadn't been able to save his family. He would save this one. "Right," Silas said, his voice low and steady, the hermit's rasp replaced by a commander's resolve. "They'll come hard. Aim for the door, the windows. We hold them off. A pony, Sikiai, watch the east and west slits. Chitsa, Ilan, stay back, tend the fire, be ready with the snow water if they try fire arrows. The rest, with me at the main window." He distributed the sharpened stakes, the bundles of prickly grass. "Remember the caltrops outside. They step wrong, they scream. Use the noise. Shoot true." He hefted the sharps, its weight comforting, purposeful. For the first time in 30 winters, the cabin wasn't a tomb. It was a fortress, and he wasn't alone within its walls. The gray light strengthened, revealing the clearing in stark monochrome. The snow lay pristine, unbroken except for the ragged trail of the scout's escape. Silas scanned the tree line, every shadow a potential enemy. Then movement. 3 figures emerged from the pines, then 5, then 7. They moved with the wary confidence of predators, fanning out, keeping trees between them and the cabin. Big men wrapped in thick furs and wool, faces obscured by scarves and hat brims. They carried rifles. Winchesters, a Spencer, and revolvers gleamed at their hips. In the center, slightly ahead, walked a man who needed no introduction. Nantan. He wasn't as tall as Silas expected, but broad, thick through the chest and shoulders. His face, revealed beneath a battered cavalry hat, was a landscape of old scars and deeper lines, framed by long, graying black hair. But it was his eyes that held Silas, dark, burning with a cold, fanatical intensity, devoid of mercy. He stopped just beyond the area where Silas had seated the caltrops, his gaze fixed on the cabin like a hawk sighting prey. "Hermit!" Nantan's voice boomed across the clearing, surprisingly deep, cutting through the morning stillness. "You shelter thieves. You harbor what is mine. Send them out. Send out the women and the spirit horse, and you might walk away from this rock with your life. Silas didn't flinch. He sighted down the sharp's barrel through the viewing slot, centering it on Nanton's broad chest. "This is my land," he called back, his voice carrying clearly. "You're trespassing. The women stay. Your trinket stays with them. Turn around. Walk away." A harsh, grating laugh erupted from Nantan. "Trinket? You ignorant stump. That power belongs to those who can take it, and take it I will." He gestured sharply. Two men broke from the tree line, moving low and fast, angling toward the cabin's west side, away from the main door and window, heading for the lean-to, the weaker point. Silas tracked them. "West side," he hissed to a pony and the woman beside her. The attackers reached the edge of the lean-to. One raised his rifle, but to smash at the weathered planks. Crunch screch. A guttural cry tore for his throat as his boot slammed down onto a hidden caltrip, the jagged punching through leather and flesh. He stumbled, crashing into his companion. At that moment, a pony acted. She shoved one of the prickly grass bundles through a narrow slit in the west shutter and hurled it downwards with all her strength. It hit the snow near the struggling men and burst apart in a cloud of fine dust and sharp needles. The second attacker recoiled, coughing, blinded, swiping at his face. "My eyes! Damn it!" Nantan snarled. "Enough! Burn them out!" He raised his arm, signaling men carrying torches they'd lit from a small fire shielded behind a tree. This was the moment Silas feared. Fire against adobe and timber. He drew a bead on the nearest torchbearer, but before he could squeeze the trigger, Chitsa stepped forward, clutching the spirit horse bundle. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent, fervent chant. Elon, seeing her, stepped up beside her, holding her little carved bear aloft, mimicking the elder's posture, her small voice joining in a thin, clear hum that resonated strangely in the confined space. A pony, understanding, moved to the main window beside Silas. She raised her voice not in fear, but in a powerful, ululating cry that echoed across the clearing, a sound of defiance and ancient lineage. The other women took it up, their voices weaving together, a haunting, dissonant chorus that seemed to vibrate the very air. The effect on Nantan was instantaneous and profound. He flinched as if struck, his burning eyes widening in shock, then dawning horror. He took an involuntary step back. The men with the torches hesitated, unnerved by the sudden, eerie sound emanating from the cabin and the sight of their leader's reaction. The chanting, the hum, the focused energy around the spirit horse. It was an attack, but profound reminder. It was the spirit of the band he betrayed, the power he sought to corrupt made manifest in the voices of those he had tried to destroy. It sings, Nantan whispered, his voice raw. The fanatical certainty momentarily shattered, replaced by something like superstitious dread. The horse rejects. Silas saw the opening. He kept the sharps leveled, but raised his voice over the chanting. "It's over, Nantan. The power you want, it ain't yours. It never was. It belongs to them, to the life you try to take. Look at it." He gestured vaguely toward the cabin, though he meant the women, the bundle, the legacy. "You touch this cabin. You touch them, that power turns against you. Feels it, don't you? Like ice in your bones." Nantan stared at the cabin, his face contorted, caught between rage and the chilling resonance of the women's chant and the spirit horse's silent rebuke. He looked at his men, unnerved and hesitant. He looked back at the cabin, the voices rising, weaving a tapestry of resilience he couldn't penetrate. The cost of taking it suddenly felt immeasurable, not just in blood, but in a deeper, spiritual damnation he feared more than death. With a roar that was part fury, part despair, Nantan spun around. "Enough!" he bellowed at his men. "We're done here. This place is cursed." He spat toward the cabin, a final gesture of impotent rage, then stalked back toward the tree line, not waiting for his men. The others, confused but relieved, helped their limping, blinded companion and followed, melting back into pines as quickly as they had appeared. The clearing was suddenly empty, silent except for the fading echo of the women's chant and the frantic beating of 10 hearts within the cabin. Silas lowered the sharp slowly, his muscles trembling with released tension. He watched the tree line long after the last shadow vanished. A pony let out a long, shuddering breath beside him, the defiance in her eyes softening into exhausted relief. The chanting subsided, replaced by soft murmurs and the sound of Elon crying quietly into Sikiai's shoulder. The little bear still clutched tight. Chitsa carefully rewrapped the spirit horse bundle, her hands steady now, a profound peace settling over her weathered face. She touched the bundle gently. "It is safe," she murmured. "We are safe." Silas turned from the window. The cabin was warm, smelling of wood smoke, fierce sweat, and something else, something fragile and new. He looked at the women. A pony's weary strength, Sikiai's quiet competence, Chitsa's serene resilience, Elon's tear-streaked face finding a tentative smile. He looked at the small wooden horse on the mantel, no longer just a relic of loss, but a symbol of protection finally fulfilled. He walked the mantel, picked up the little horse. It smoothed what was warm from the fire. He crossed the room and knelt before Elon. Her dark eyes, wide and trusting, looked up at him. Silas held out the carving. "For the bear," he said gruffly. "Strength needs company." Elon looked from the horse to her bear, then back to Silas. Slowly, solemnly, she took the offering, clutching both carvings together in her small hands. A genuine, tremulous smile broke through her tears. A pony stepped forward, placing a hand on Silas's shoulder. The gesture was simple, human. "Silas Morrow," she said, the name spoken with a newfound weight, a recognition. "The mountain holds more than silence now. It holds us." Silas looked around to faces watching him. Faces that had been strangers spat from a blizzard, now etched into the fabric of his existence. The crushing weight of 30 winters of solitude lifted, not vanished, but transformed. The grief of Martha and Ben was still there, a deep canyon in his soul, but no longer the only landscape. It was joined now by the rugged foothills of responsibility, the fragile meadows of connection, the unexpected river of shared survival. Outside, the sun finally crested Ironback Ridge, bathing the snow-covered clearing in pure, golden light. It sparkled on the untouched drifts, glinted off the abandoned knife Silas had tossed into the woodpile, and warmed the thick adobe walls of the cabin. Winter's grip was still firm, the mountains still vast and unforgiving. But within the cabin's walls, warmed by the fire and a hard-won peace, something had taken root, not just survival, not just sanctuary. Home. Silas Morrow, the man carved from silence, took a deep breath of the smoke-scented air, the voices of the women a soft murmur around him, and felt the ice around his own heart begin slowly to thaw. The mountain had given him back a reason to endure. The long winter wasn't over, but for the first time in 30 years, Silas Morrow wasn't facing it alone.